How many people are inside the house right now? We need a straight answer.
You have no warrant. Please step back.
Then explain the constant visitors. We've had reports about this address.
This is my residence. Remove your hands.
He's not cooperating.
Cruising a federal inquiry. Don't make this harder than it needs to be.
Let go of me.
Detain him.
Got it. Hold his arm. Hold it. Hey, stop.
7:42 a.m. on a quiet residential street in Washington, D.C., federal immigration agents detained a homeowner based solely on a neighbor's complaint. No warrant was issued, no verification was completed. Within hours, those same agents would learn they had just arrested a sitting Supreme Court judge, a U.S.-born citizen, in front of his own home. By then, it was already too late to undo what had been set in motion. If you want the full reconstruction of what really happened that morning and how it destroyed multiple careers, subscribe to this channel. Foxhall Crescent, NW, had a reputation for stillness, early dog walkers, trimmed hedges, minimal noise, people who preferred distance over conversation. Cassian Reeve Montclair had lived there for 27 days. 52 years old, federal Supreme Court judge, nearly 3 decades in constitutional law, known professionally for precision, restraint, and an almost clinical commitment to legal procedure. He chose the property for one practical reason: it was a 9-minute drive to the courthouse where he presided. Most residents barely knew he existed. He left early, returned late, lights on his home office past midnight most evenings. From across the street, Beatrice Lynn Behringer noticed everything. She had lived on Foxhall Crescent for 31 years. Property records showed she had challenged zoning approvals twice, filed multiple noise complaints against previous residents, and chaired the Neighborhood Preservation Committee for nearly a decade. She rarely spoke directly to Cassian, but she watched him, from behind curtains, from her front steps, from the upstairs window facing his driveway. The barbecue changed something. The previous Saturday afternoon, Cassian hosted family, cousins, siblings, nieces, nephews. Cars lined the curb, laughter carried across the street, music low but present, nothing unlawful, nothing excessive. Beatrice stood at her window longer than usual. The next morning, at 6:18 a.m., she placed a call to immigration enforcement. Her voice was controlled but urgent. "I don't believe the man across from me is legally here. There were many of them last night. They don't behave like residents. That house may be sheltering illegals. Someone needs to investigate immediately." No one asked how she knew, no one verified property ownership, no one checked identification records. At 7:39 a.m., 3 federal vehicles turned onto Foxhall Crescent. Cassian was in his kitchen reviewing case briefs, still in a pressed white shirt, coffee untouched beside an open legal file. Through the front window, he noticed the vehicles first: dark SUVs, government plates. Across the street, Beatrice had already stepped onto her porch. She folded her arms slowly, watching. Agent Garrick Nolan exited the lead vehicle first. Preston Wickford followed, scanning the property like it had already been flagged high risk. Jet Corbin adjusted his vest, eyes fixed on the house. "There's no visual movement inside," Jet said. Garrick didn't respond. He was already walking toward the front door. Across the street, Beatrice remained still, expression tight, satisfied, waiting. Cassian opened the door before they knocked. "Good morning," he said calmly. Garrick's eyes moved over him once, slow, dismissive. "Step outside," he ordered. Cassian didn't move. "On what authority?" he asked evenly. Preston exchanged a glance with Garrick, the kind that assumed defiance before explanation. Behind them, Beatrice watched without blinking. Garrick stepped forward. "We'll explain when you comply." And that was the moment the encounter stopped being procedural and started being something else entirely. Cassian remained standing in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame. "I asked on what authority," he repeated, voice level. "Do you have a warrant?" Garrick Nolan didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on Cassian with open irritation, not confusion, not caution, irritation. "Sir, step outside," he said again, slower this time, as if speaking to someone deliberately difficult. "I will cooperate with lawful instructions," Cassian replied. "Produce the warrant." Behind Garrick, Preston Wickford gave a short, humorless laugh. "You people always want paperwork. Funny how that works." Cassian's expression didn't change. "Identify yourself and state the legal basis for your presence on my property." Jet Corbin shifted his weight, scanning the house interior past Cassian's shoulder. "Looks like bigger than what he should be affording," Jet said quietly, but not quietly enough. Across the street, Beatrice Barringer leaned forward slightly, arms still folded, watching closely, not surprised, not concerned, waiting for confirmation of what she already believed. Garrick stepped closer to the threshold, inside Cassian's personal space now. "We received a report of immigration violations at this residence. You are being investigated." "A report is not probable cause, and you still have not identified yourselves." Preston moved up beside Garrick. "We don't need to explain federal authority to you." Cassian's gaze shifted briefly between them, assessing, controlled. "Yes," he said calmly, "you do." That was when Garrick reached for Cassian's arm. It was abrupt, not investigative, not procedural, a physical assertion of control. Cassian pulled his arm back immediately. "Do not touch me," he said, voice firmer now. "You are overstepping lawful authority." That resistance, even verbal, even measured, changed the atmosphere instantly. Preston's posture stiffened. Jet's hand moved toward his restraints. Garrick's voice hardened. "You are obstructing a federal inquiry." "I am asserting my rights as a property owner and citizen." Preston stepped forward suddenly, grabbing Cassian's wrist. "Step out, now." Cassian held his ground. "You are acting without legal justification." From across the street, Beatrice's voice carried clearly. "I told you he wouldn't cooperate. They never do." Silence hung for half-second. Then Garrick nodded once, a decision made without discussion. "Detain him." Jet moved immediately, gripping Cassian's other arm. Preston forced his hands behind his back. The movement was fast, mechanical, practiced restraint without verified cause. "This is unlawful detention," Cassian said, breathing controlled but strained as pressure tightened around his wrists. "You are making a serious procedural error." Preston leaned closer as he secured the restraints. "Yeah," he said quietly, "you can explain that downtown." Neighbors' doors opened, phones lifted. Someone across the street began recording openly now. Cassian was guided, not gently, down his front steps. His case files still sat open on the kitchen counter, coffee untouched. Beatrice Barringer remained on her porch, watching as federal agents escorted her neighbor across his own lawn in restraints. No warrant had been shown, no verification attempted, no identification accepted. At 7:46 a.m., Cassian Reeve Montclair was placed into the back of a federal vehicle. And the street, once silent, was now filled with witnesses. At 7:52 a.m., the federal vehicles cleared Foxhall Crescent. Inside the rear compartment, Cassian Reeve Montclair sat upright, wrists secured behind his back, shoulders steady despite the pressure of the restraints cutting into the tendons above his hands. He had stopped speaking after the second time his request for identification was ignored. Across from him, Jet Corbin kept watching his face, not curious, not cautious, just suspicious, like he was waiting for something to confirm what he already believed. Preston Wickford sat beside the door, scrolling through intake notes on a tablet. Caller says multiple unknown occupants, possible harboring, says gatherings are frequent. Cassian spoke without raising his voice. That gathering was a family barbecue. No one responded. Garrick Nolan, seated in the front passenger seat, spoke without turning around. You can explain all of that during processing. Cassian leaned slightly forward despite the restraints. You are detaining a homeowner without a warrant, without verified cause, and without establishing identity. That is not processing. That is unlawful seizure. Preston smirked faintly. We'll sort that out. Icefield Processing Unit, 8:21 a.m. The intake room was sterile, fluorescent, procedural, metal desk, camera mounted high in the corner, standard biometric station along the far wall. Cassian was seated, restraints removed only after he was secured to the chair anchor. Jet stood against the wall. Preston began entering basic data. Name, Preston said flatly. Cassian looked directly at him. Cassian Reeve Montclair. Typing paused. Preston looked up. Spell it. Cassian did. Preston entered the information into the federal database system, routine identity scan, standard cross-reference. 3 seconds passed. Then the system flagged. A sharp notification tone broke the room's silence. Preston frowned and leaned closer to the screen. What? He muttered. He refreshed the search. Same result. He didn't speak immediately, just stared. Garrick stepped closer. What is it? Preston turned the monitor slightly. Database hit, he said quietly. Federal Judiciary Registry. Silence. Jet shifted against the wall. That's not possible. Preston scrolled further. Birth records populated automatically. Birthplace, Baltimore, Maryland, United States. Citizenship status, natural-born U.S. citizen. No immigration file, no visa history, no enforcement flags, nothing. Because there was never supposed to be anything. Garrick's expression changed first. Not confusion, but the sudden tightening of someone realizing a situation had moved far outside containment. Preston spoke again, quieter now. He's fully documented federal authority. Jet stared at Cassian, really looking at him for the first time. Cassian met their gaze calmly. I told you to verify. Outside the intake room, movement began almost immediately, staff crossing hallways faster than before, low voices, one supervisor entering, then another. Within minutes, the holding floor received a priority alert. Within 10 minutes, regional command was notified. Within 15 minutes, internal review protocol was activated. And across the city, inside the courthouse where Cassian Reeve Montclair was scheduled to preside at 9:30 a.m., his absence had just been reported. At 9:41 a.m., Chambers staff began calling his direct line. No response. At 9:46 a.m., his judicial clerk contacted building security to confirm whether he had entered through another access point. He had not. At 9:52 a.m., the clerk notified the Office of Court Administration. By 10:03 a.m., Dr. Linnea Margot Severin was on the phone. What do you mean he hasn't arrived? She asked, voice controlled but tight. She listened for 12 seconds, then hung up, then immediately began dialing federal agency liaison channels one by one. At 10:11 a.m., she reached ICE Regional Operations. This is Dr. Linnea Severin, Senior Court Administrator for Justice Montclair. I need confirmation that your agency is not currently detaining a federal judge. Silence on the other end. Then, ma'am, hold please. Back at the field processing unit, the atmosphere had shifted from procedural to contained panic. Supervisors were now inside the intake room. No one raised their voice, but movement was faster, clipped, controlled. The kind of tension that comes from knowing something irreversible had already happened. Garrick Nolan stood rigid near the wall as a regional compliance officer reviewed the arrest record. "No warrant requested," the officer said flatly. Preston Wickford swallowed once but said nothing. The officer continued reading from the report. "Detention initiated based solely on civilian complaint, no identity verification prior to restraint, subject identification statements disregarded multiple times." He lowered the tablet and looked directly at Garrick. "Why?" Garrick hesitated, just long enough for the room to register it. "The caller reported illegal occupants and suspicious gatherings," he said. "Subject was uncooperative." Cassian spoke from the chair, voice steady. "I requested lawful documentation, that is not non-compliance." The compliance officer didn't look at him, he kept his eyes on Garrick. "Did you confirm property ownership?" "No." "Run preliminary identity scan on site?" "No." "Observe evidence of immigration violations?" "No." Silence pressed into the room. From the back wall, Jet Corbin shifted uneasily. "He didn't look like he belonged there," he said quietly. No one responded immediately, but everyone heard it. The compliance officer turned slowly toward him. "Explain that statement." Jet didn't answer. Across the room, Preston spoke, defensive now. "The neighbor was certain, said the house was being used to bring more of them in, said there were groups gathering." Cassian turned his head slightly. "My extended family," he said. The compliance officer exhaled slowly, then spoke into his radio. "Flag this as full procedural breach. Escalate to federal oversight immediately." At 10:26 a.m., Dr. Linnea Severin arrived in person. Her credentials cleared 3 security doors in under 90 seconds. She entered the intake room, eyes moving first to the restraints anchoring the chair, then to Cassian, then to the agents. Her voice was calm, but cold. "Remove the restraints," she said. No one moved. She repeated it. "Now." They did. She stepped closer to Cassian. "Your Honor, are you injured?" He said no. She turned to the room. "From this moment forward, this is no longer an administrative matter. This is a federal rights violation under active review." Outside the building, news alerts had already begun spreading. And across Foxhall Crescent, Beatrice Lynn Behringer was telling another neighbor that she had done exactly what anyone responsible would do. By noon, her version of events had already changed 3 times. First, she said she was protecting the neighborhood. Then she said she had observed suspicious patterns for weeks. By 12:18 p.m., she was telling anyone who would listen that authorities had confirmed her concerns. They had not. At 12:32 p.m., a black government sedan pulled onto Foxhall Crescent. 2 federal investigators stepped out, badges visible but not displayed theatrically. They walked directly to Beatrice's front door. She opened it halfway. "Yes?" she asked, posture guarded but composed. "We need to discuss the call you placed to Federal Immigration Enforcement this morning." Her chin lifted slightly. "I reported what I saw." "What exactly did you see?" She hesitated just briefly. "Well, gatherings, unfamiliar vehicles, people coming and going. He never socializes, doesn't engage, doesn't fit the neighborhood profile." One investigator wrote that down. "Define profile, please." Beatrice's expression hardened. "You can't seriously expect me to believe that man belongs here." The investigator did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked the next question carefully. "Did you have any evidence he was not a U.S. citizen?" "No, but—" "Had you spoken to him?" "No." "Verified ownership of the property?" "No." "Observed criminal activity?" "No, but it was obvious something was wrong." "What was obvious?" Beatrice crossed her arms. "He had too many people there. They looked out of place." Silence. One investigator stopped writing. Across the city, the situation inside the ICE field office had fully escalated. By 1:05 p.m., Garrick Nolan, Preston Wickford, and Jet Corbin had been separated and placed under administrative restriction pending formal review. Their badges were collected first, then their service credentials. No one used the word suspension yet, but the language had shifted to phrases like operational misconduct, civil rights exposure, and federal liability. Body camera footage had already been pulled, not requested, pulled. At 12:22 p.m., Internal Legal Review completed its preliminary classification: unlawful detention, failure of verification, excessive force risk, discriminatory enforcement indicators. At 1:47 p.m., a media alert broke through major national outlets. Federal agents detain sitting Supreme Court justice at private residence following unverified civilian complaint. Within minutes, reporters began assembling outside both the courthouse and the ICE regional office. Inside a secured conference room, Cassian Reeve Montclair sat across from Dr. Linnea Severin and two federal oversight attorneys. His wrists were no longer marked by restraints, but the impression of pressure remained visible along the skin. One attorney spoke carefully. "Your Honor, we will be initiating immediate federal review of all involved personnel and responding authority chains." Cassian nodded once. "What about the source of the report?" he asked. Dr. Severin answered, "She is being interviewed now." Cassian held her gaze. "Good," he said quietly, "because none of this began with the agents." Outside the building, cameras multiplied. Across Foxhall Crescent, neighbors who had barely spoken to Cassian for weeks were now replaying the morning in fragments: the shouting, the restraints, the certainty in Beatrice's voice. And by late afternoon, the recording Graham Elliott Sutter captured from his front porch began circulating online. Clear audio, clear visuals, clear enough for the country to see exactly how quickly assumption turned into action. By early evening, the footage Graham Elliott Sutter recorded had been broadcast across national news networks, legal analysis panels, and federal oversight briefings. The video showed the full sequence: the command to step outside, the refusal to present a warrant, the physical restraint, the dismissive tone, and the moment Beatrice Lynn Behringer's voice carried from across the street: "I told you he wouldn't cooperate. They never do." That sentence alone was replayed repeatedly. At 8:14 p.m., ICE Regional Command issued an official administrative action notice. Garrick Nolan, Preston Wickford, and Jet Corbin were formally suspended pending federal civil rights investigation. Their field authority was revoked indefinitely. Internal disciplinary review expanded to include supervisory approval chains and response authorization procedures. By the next morning, federal oversight classified the case as a confirmed unlawful detention of a U.S.-born citizen and federal judicial officer, initiated without probable cause, warrant, or verification. The legal exposure was immediate and severe. Beatrice Lynn Behringer's call recording was released under investigative review 2 days later. Her statements were unambiguous. No evidence, no observation of crime, no verification attempt, only suspicion rooted in presence. Who lived there? Who visited? Who fit the neighborhood? The district attorney's office opened formal proceedings for false reporting and misuse of emergency response authority. Civil liability followed soon after. Her standing within Foxhall Crescent collapsed faster than the investigation itself. Residents who once exchanged polite greetings now avoided her entirely. The Neighborhood Preservation Committee removed her leadership status unanimously. She had wanted enforcement action. She received national exposure instead. Cassian Reeve Montclair returned to the bench the following week. He did not make a public speech. He did not address the press directly, but a written federal statement was released through judicial administration. No authority exists without accountability. No enforcement action is lawful without verification. Procedure is not optional, especially when power is involved. Within 6 months, revised federal field protocols were implemented nationwide. Mandatory on-site identity verification, civilian complaint escalation review, documentation confirmation before detention authority. The case was cited in federal training materials as a procedural failure with constitutional impact. Vauxhall Crescent returned to quiet routines eventually, but not to silence. Residents remembered the vehicles, the restraints, the certainty, the speed at which accusation became action, and the speed at which reality dismantled it. One false call, 3 ruined careers, 1 exposed motive, and a permanent federal policy change. If you want more incident reconstructions, documented cases, and in-depth breakdowns of how power, bias, and accountability collide in the real world, subscribe to Evidence of Hate Reports. Because what you've just watched happen on one quiet street has happened before, and will happen again, unless it's seen, documented, and understood.